Hi, I'm Connor. Welcome to New Super Pocket Talk. So you might remember in the first video, what we talked about was the NES, which was Nintendo's first big mainstream success. They had the TV color games in Japan before then and done quite well from them, but the NES was where they really hit it on a global scale, especially in the US. But in the UK and Europe, the NES didn't actually do as well. The Sega Master System came out around the same time, or slightly before in some cases, and gained a bit of a foothold there. And Nintendo wanted to change that. So their solution was the SNES. So the NES was looking a bit backwards by the early 90s. There were other consoles starting to kind of fight in terms of technological advancement, not necessarily in sales numbers. Nintendo still owned that. But in terms of actual technological advancement, there were other consoles kind of vying for it. And Sega was releasing their next generation console too. So what did Nintendo do? They released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the SNES for short. The SNES released in 1990 in Japan, 91 in North America, and then in 1992 in Europe and Australia. It was a 16-bit console that took what the NES had done and made it, well, super. And as per before, they released it as the Super Famicom in Japan, so the Super Family Computer, and it came with a whole different design. Sega wasn't far behind, so in 1988, or between 1988 and 1990, they released what some countries call the Genesis, some call the Mega Drive. UK is Mega Drive, I believe the US is Genesis. And they also introduced a new mascot to rival Mario, a little blue hedgehog called Sonic, who you might have heard of. Despite the head start on Nintendo, Sega actually lost this generation of the console war. They sold about 30 million of the Mega Drive / Genesis as compared to 49 million units of the SNES. And that kind of started the narrative of how Nintendo kind of won the console wars of that generation. But they'd won that battle, they hadn't yet won the war, but it was a massive blow to Sega, which we'll see in future videos really sent them down. The fourth generation of consoles, so the Genesis and SNES for the most part, was defined by 16-bit technology, so the previous generation used 8-bit. What's the difference? More bits. But essentially they could process much more quickly, and it allowed for better graphical capabilities. So the NES was limited to 56 colours, and that's the same 56 colours across every single game that used the system. That's 25 colours at once though, so it could only use 13 colours in the background of whatever you had on screen, and then 12 in the foreground, and one of those colours was transparency. When the SNES released, it could use over 32,000 different colours, so that's a massive increase over the NES's 56, and then it could display up to 256 colours at once on screen. So if you look at kind of the original Zelda as compared to the first Zelda on the SNES, there's a massive difference between those two games, which are essentially sharing the same DNA. I think the difference between the two is that in one of those you can really see that the sprites are there to tell the story. They're like one step up from a text-based game, whereas in the other they are almost art. And I do think that's what the SNES did. It made sprite work an art form, and games still use those colour palettes to this day. I mentioned in my last video that I struggle to play a lot of NES games because they're so basic and because there's so many compromises that have to be made in order to play them. But I think the SNES is the first time that games to me feel modern. I think, though it's grown over the years, the pixel art style was perfected on the SNES, and so many games still call back to that to this day. Of course, there are games that now try and copy the 8-bit aesthetic, or even some that use 1-bit aesthetic, but I just think there's a reason the SNES is so timeless. If you look at games like Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, they all feel revitalized on the SNES, and you can see these games that could have just been one-offs all of a sudden grow into kind of the franchises and the big gaming legends that we know of today. One of the later games released for the SNES was Yoshi's Island, and that is an example of how beautiful a game can be on really limited constraints when it comes to graphics. It uses the SNES to its full capabilities and more with the Super FX chip, which I think is a topic for another video. And it uses these really painterly sprites, uses parallax backgrounds, uses 3D graphics in a really limited way because the SNES couldn't do much more, but it looks so much more beautiful than most of the 3D games that came after it. The SNES wasn't just a great pixel art machine, it was also an adequate 3D machine for its time. One of the SNES's launch games in the US and Europe was Pilot Wings, which is one of my favourites, and it uses 3D in games in a way that I don't think had really been seen so much before in a home console. It's a bit flat, it's basic, it still uses sprite art in really great and interesting ways, but it does use 3D, and can't imagine being at home and going from the NES and its kind of pre-drawn racing games to doing that, where you can all of a sudden travel in a 3D world. The levels are really simple, but I really enjoy playing them now to this day in my own downtime, just for a few minutes at a time, much in the same way I mentioned that the NES for me is only enjoyable in short bursts. 3D games on the SNES feel the same way to me. And as we're talking about the pioneering use of 3D on the SNES, I can't go without talking about three of Nintendo's longest running franchises that were born on the SNES because of that capability. So the first is Mario Kart, now the best-selling game on the Switch, has for a long time been one of the best-selling games in Nintendo's library. Revolutionary at the time, 3D kart racing on a console which had really been best at just 2D sprite work. And it still holds up to this day. I play it every now and then. Again, it's a short burst one because it doesn't feel like the modern games, but you can see that DNA running all the way back to it. F-Zero also got its start on the SNES, and that you can see again, that kind of DNA that runs through the whole series up until the entries on the GameCube. F-Zero's been a bit dormant for a few years now, but it has been revived on the Switch as F-Zero 99, and it's using those original SNES graphics, which I think says how well they hold up. And I played it for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and I loved it. I really enjoy F-Zero, and actually going back and playing the SNES version makes me wish that they'd put one out on the Switch. And then the other franchise that was born here was Star Fox, which has kind of been sent to Nintendo's dungeon. That was one of the real pioneers in 3D. It uses polygons more than anything else, rather than sprite work, and it doesn't hold up. Again, like those early NES games, it just doesn't quite stack up to what games are today, and that's fair enough. Games have moved on. It's just one of those ones that as a modern gamer can be quite difficult to play. The frame rates are really low, there's huge amounts of pop-in. It's good, it started it all off, but it's not something that I go back and play now. Star Fox has kind of been relegated to the B tier of Nintendo mascots. I think more people know the characters from Smash Brothers than they do Star Fox itself, and I can kind of see why the Wii U game that came out wasn't particularly well received, but with Mario Kart especially, you can really see its DNA running through the current games, and I think that's fantastic. It is a game that's kind of held up to the test of time, and if it hasn't, its successors have, and not many games can say they've got a 30-year heritage, and most of them, to be honest, are Nintendo games. So there are some games that like to trick the player into thinking they're 3D. Donkey Kong Country Returns and Super Mario RPG use 3D rendered models that they've then flattened into sprites to make it look as though the whole game is in 3D. Personally, I don't think these games have aged as well as the pixel art games that came before them. I think pixel art matured on the SNES, became almost what it is today, whereas 3D was so experimental, and it's fantastic that they were pushing the limits like this, but it just doesn't look as good. They look shiny, they look like early 3D models, even though they're pre-rendered. Nintendo has never necessarily excelled at keeping up with the competition graphically, and I think their simple sprite work really aged well compared to their early attempts at 3D. If the NES was a revolution in gaming, then the SNES was more of a quiet evolution, but it perfected all the things that the NES had started to do well. All of a sudden, games felt like art, and some of the games on the SNES are so beautiful, and in my opinion, some of the best looking games of all time. It doesn't matter that they don't have any 3D graphics or they arrived 30 years before ray tracing. They just look stunning. But at one point, developers have pushed the console to its very limit. Games like Yoshi's Island and Star Fox required extra enhancements in their cartridges, and though they looked beautiful, they weren't keeping up with the new competition. In 1994, Sony released the PlayStation, a fully 3D console, and the next year after that, Sega did exactly the same with the Saturn, so the SNES was starting to look a bit long in the tooth. At the dawn of the 3D gaming era, it was time for the SNES to rest. In 1996, Nintendo released the Nintendo 64, the first fully 3D console by Nintendo. However, the SNES actually wasn't discontinued until 2003 fully. By the end of its life, it had sold 49 million consoles and given us some of the best games of all time. At the end of its life, the SNES was really showing its age. It couldn't play the latest games anymore, and it was out of fashion, really. But the Game Boy Advance around at the same time has quite often been called a mini SNES because it does use very similar graphics to that old console, just a couple of generations behind. But the SNES remains a timeless classic, and the games released for it look just as beautiful today and just as current today as they did the day they were released, which is, I don't think, something that you can say about the generation before or the generation after. But that's a video for another time. Thanks for watching.